Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the Equity Pulse brought by Committee of 100. My name is Cindy Tsai. I am the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Committee of 100. For those of you who are not familiar with C100, our mission is to advocate for the full inclusion of Chinese Americans here in the U.S., as well as foster constructive relations between the United States and Greater China. Part of our work in advancing our dual mission is an annual survey called the State of Chinese Americans. This year, our findings showed that AAPI's sense of belonging have decreased, and it affects our community's mental well-being. With policies that increase policies and laws that affect immigrants and marginalized communities, this finding was not particularly surprising that our sense of belonging here in this country have decreased. And that's what formed the genesis of this new programming, the Equity Pulse. It's a monthly webinar, and moving forward, it will be held at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, on every third Tuesday of each month. We will touch on policies and laws with unfair outcomes. I'm excited to introduce today's featured speaker, Frank Wu. Frank is the current president at Queens College, a prolific writer on a wide range of topics, including racial equity, the perpetual foreigner, education access. We often hear that if you don't learn from history, history will repeat itself. So today, Frank will be talking to us about some of the historical policies and laws that have had unfair outcomes for the AAPI community and touch on how they are presented today. Before I turn it over to Frank, just a few housekeeping. First, the session will be recorded. Also, we will pepper in the questions from the audience throughout this session, so please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you may have. And then at the end of this webinar, once you close out of Zoom, you'll be prompted to have a post-event survey. I encourage you all to complete that survey. It's especially important for us since this is a new program. We want to get as much insight as is for the community. On the bottom of the survey, there is an open field. If you have any particular topics or issues that you would like us to address in this series, please feel free to make that recommendation. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Frank.
Hello, good afternoon. It is great to be here, and I'm so honored to be the first speaker in this wonderful series. I am a former law professor, and whenever lawyers or law professors speak, they make 3 points. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first is the history. Oh, sorry, I have ink on my hands. I still use an old-fashioned fountain pen to take notes. It's better for your brain to actually take notes than to just be typing all the time. I'm going to talk about the history of what is called the perpetual foreigner syndrome, the sense that you're a sojourner, even if you're a 6th-generation American. Second, I'd like to talk about the effects today, and I'm going to try to be as concrete as possible and give you examples. And third, I'd like to talk about advocacy. What can we do? What should we do? What must we do as individuals and as a community? Now, let me start by defining some terms. So the perpetual foreigner syndrome is this sense that back in the day, they used the word sojourner. You don't hear that word anymore very often. It's different than immigrant. It suggests you're a transient. You're just here temporarily traveling, like the character in the Kung Fu TV series that was supposed to have gone to Bruce Lee, but instead went to a Caucasian actor, someone who's just not of the land, who's wandering through the West and who eventually will return to China. So the idea is your heart is not here. You are unlike European immigrants who wish to put down new roots and raise a family. You are perhaps a spy, maybe disloyal. Your heart belongs elsewhere. Now, let me be clear. There's nothing wrong with being from China or Taiwan or Hong Kong or the Philippines and of Chinese descent. I want to be absolutely clear about that. My parents, of course, were immigrants, newcomers to this nation. The issue isn't that you're from someplace else as you choose to define it, but that you lose control. Some people, when they're asked, where are you from? They get to say, Detroit. That's where I'm from, the Motor City. But for other people, when they say that, you're told, where are you really from? And the addition of that one word speaks volumes because it says you're a liar. You're not who you claim to be. You're somebody else. You know, if you're Mandarin speaking, I'll give you a very contemporary version of this in Mandarin. 现在美国的政府觉得中国的学生都是间谍. Now, if you're not Mandarin speaking, what I said, and I've practiced that phonetically, which is why it sounds good. American government officials now believe that every Chinese student is a spy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, then the contemporary examples, then what we can do. So I'll offer you several different examples of this. The easiest one to point to is the Exclusion Act. You know, if you know anything about Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, you've heard of the Transcontinental Railroad that united this nation after it had been rent asunder by the Civil War between the North and the South. So that ended in 1865. And a project started that at the time was considered speculative, a little crazy. It was the largest, most massive infrastructure project attempted in the United States at the time. And it united the states. There's a way, you know, I'm a writer, so I think about language. There's a way that you can tell grammatically. It used to be, back then, people would say the United States as a plural, not a singular. So if you wanted to say the United States are beautiful, that's how you would phrase it. The United States are a beautiful nation. To us today, that sounds a little odd. You would say the United States is a beautiful nation, right? But the reason they said it back then is because the United States was disunited, not just as a result of the Civil War. It was impossible to travel easily from Boston to San Francisco, which was then a frontier, or Los Angeles. You had to sail for months. So the Transcontinental Railroad was this project that was proposed. And as you know, half, the western half, was built by Chinese laborers, 10 to 15,000 men. Those tracks are still in use. The other half was built, much of it, by Irish laborers. And back then, ethnic work crews were very common. So the Chinese laborers did this amazing job. But afterward, if you study the history, you know, the context is so important to this. The United States fell into a recession. So the Transcontinental Railroad was a success. But the United States economy, not too long thereafter, wasn't doing well. That's when scapegoating started. The phrase was, the Chinese must go. That was the rallying cry, and politicians of both political parties sought to outdo themselves, and the Exclusion Act was passed by Congress in 1882 and kept being extended, eventually forming an Asiatic barred zone in 1917 that lasted until 1952. And not only that, our ancestors could not naturalize. There was a color bar. You had to show you were a free white person or of African nativity or descent. And a couple of Asian immigrants sued all the way up to the Supreme Court and lost. So what happened was Asian immigrants were put into this category as aliens ineligible to citizenship. More than that, it wasn't until the 1890s that birthright citizenship was established, much in the news again, because it wasn't just the newcomers. Those born on American soil. That was very rare. Very rare because you may know there's also a gender bar. Asian women weren't allowed in. And so in San Francisco's Chinatown, the ratio was 100 to 1, men to women. Can you imagine that in that hyper-segregated neighborhood? And intermarriage was illegal. And in many of the states, that wasn't just black-white. Asians were on the wrong side of the color line. So there was no intermarriage, but there were a few families and there were a few children of Chinese descent born on this soil. It wasn't until Wong Kim Ark went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court as a native-born San Franciscan, opposed by the federal government and by organizations such as the Native Sons of the Golden West, that birthright citizenship was finally established. And if you read the briefs that the government filed, they said, just as Chinese immigrants could be excluded, so too their descendants should be prohibited from joining the body politic, becoming equals. So that's the clearest legal example for Chinese Americans of just being excluded, falling into a category of aliens ineligible to citizenship. So the idea was, even if you came legally, even if you're allowed to be here, you couldn't stay, you shouldn't stay, you mustn't stay. But note, Chinese immigrants didn't just take it. They organized, they sued all the way up to the US Supreme Court again and again and again, meaning they wanted to belong. You know, some folks back then made arguments they're heathen, they're dirty, they spread disease. And then they said, the more sophisticated, I mean, some were just what we would recognize to be bigots, and they were open about it. But some said, no, no, there's a difference because they're sojourners. They don't want to be Americans anyway. That's what justifies us keeping them out. This gets it all wrong because if you look at European migration, there was a lot of what is called return migration. And the effort to sue up to the Supreme Court meant that these communities in San Francisco and elsewhere wanted to stay. They sought to be Americans. And when they left, it was out of disappointment, embitterment, having to eat bitterness, you know, that phrase in Chinese, that they realized they wouldn't be accepted here. So if you meet, and every now and then, maybe in the audience, there's somebody who can claim to be a sixth generation New Yorker, and there are Chinese Americans who can make that claim. But if you talk to them, you find out generations 3 and 4 or 4 and 5 were actually born overseas. The reason is because of all of these laws that made it difficult, if not impossible, for Chinese Americans to be Chinese Americans. The other big example for Asian Americans is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, I want to be clear. Japan was an enemy nation. The attack on Pearl Harbor was unprovoked. And what happened was Japanese Americans, two-thirds US born in Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, were blamed, were said to be agents of the empire. There was no example at all of espionage or sabotage or treason from the Japanese American community on the United States mainland during the entirety of World War II, including prior to the internment. But all these rumors spread. You can't trust these people. I'll use a word we shouldn't use. The general in charge of the Western Defense, John DeWitt, said, a Jap's a Jap, and that's all there is to it. So they were locked up, including men, women, children, disabled, orphans, the elderly, and United States military veterans. The most poignant photo is of a Japanese American fellow, older by then, in his uniform, in his United States Army uniform that he wore when he fought for his nation, the United States, in the Great War, before they had to number world wars. And they lost everything: liberty, dignity. There were suicides in the camp. If you got too close to the fence, you would be shot. And it was based on this premise that they weren't real Americans. That's the perpetual foreigner syndrome for you. The last historical example I'll give you is the murder of Vincent Chin. We don't have enough time for an entire talk about Vincent Chin. I've done talks like that, including for Committee of 100. You can find them on YouTube. If you don't know the name Vincent Chin, you should. His case means so much to me personally. I didn't know him, but I grew up in Detroit. I was about a decade younger when he was brutally murdered. So I'm just going to give you the briefest outline. Chin was Chinese American, 27 years old, working class, not the model minority. He dropped out of college. He worked as a waiter at a Chinese restaurant like his father before him. He was trained to be a draftsman. He was due to be married. This was during a terrible recession. Some of you are old enough to remember the late 70s, early 80s. The US was doing poorly. But Japan was taking off, Japan Incorporated. And if you're old enough to remember this, you remember nobody used to drive imported cars. The Detroit Big Four had 99% market share. If you drove an imported car from Japan, well, hippies had VWs, some rich people had Mercedes, but nobody drove a car from Japan. People might key the car. You remember that? They would take a key and ruin your paint job by running across the front, throw a brick through your windshield. There were signs saying, no Jap crap allowed in this parking lot. Well, in 1982, in Detroit, Chin, due to be married, proposed to a young lady, Chinese American like him, working class like him. He's just a guy, he's no saint. He went for a bachelor's party in a seedy part of town to a strip club. And there were two gentlemen there, auto workers, white, who, according to witnesses, not just Chin's friends, but other witnesses, started to use those slurs that we know well. They called him a chink, a Jap. They used a term you don't even hear anymore, nip. And then, according to one of the dancers at the club, somebody shouted at him from the side of the table where the two perpetrators were sitting, and they never denied they carried out the act. I want to be clear. They always admitted, because there were dozens of witnesses. Someone shouted, pardon the language. They shouted at him, "You little motherfucker. It's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." This meant it was mistaken identity twice over. He was Chinese, not Japanese. It wouldn't have been right had they found a Japanese foreigner. I want to be clear about that. But he was also an American, not a foreigner, and he was just like them, blue collar. Before the evening was out, after a scuffle inside, using a baseball bat they had in the trunk of their car, they cracked his skull open. And with blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter pulling out of the pavement beneath him, he uttered in Cantonese the last words, "It's not fair." Let me reiterate, the two men who killed him always admitted they did it. They said it was just a bar brawl. They were no bigots. They were sentenced to probation and a fine. A massive protest ensued. People had never seen anything like that. And the Chin case was not isolated. When you look at the other attacks, and I'm about to turn to my second point about the perpetual foreigner syndrome today. During COVID, we saw this. People shouting, "Go back to where you came from," shouting racial slurs. And we know that from when we walk down the street, and it still happens. And it's all a signal, you're not one of us, you're one of them. You made us sick, right? So those are my historical examples. Let me now turn to the perpetual foreigner syndrome today. COVID is now a memory. But when COVID was here, case after case, and initially people said, it's random. You don't know that that's racial. But you saw the videos of Asian elders, men and women, being spit on, shoved to the ground, kicked in the head, shoved down the stairs leading to the subway, stabbed, ultimately in Atlanta, shot. And these were individuals who, and you never know when you're walking down the street and someone starts shouting at you, whether it will escalate or if it's just someone shouting some slurs. But in these attacks, what made it clear, and you don't know in any specific case because you can't look into someone's heart, you don't know. Are they a KKK member or skinhead? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just your neighbor, which makes it even more frightening. But with COVID and people blaming China, saying it came from Wuhan, the people who were attacked, some of them weren't Chinese, they weren't from Wuhan. There were people who were Filipino, people who were Korean, even in some instances, people who were Latina and looked Asian were attacked and violent attacks. So even if we don't know in any one case, when you look at the pattern, it's difficult to deny that there's something going on here. It's about race. It's about taking a virus which could affect any of us. And By the way, as people pointed out, Asian Americans were overrepresented among first responders, healthcare professionals, Filipino nurses, for example. And there were even people who, when brought into the hospital, died, said that they didn't want a doctor or nurse of Asian background to touch them or work on them. That's the perpetual foreigner syndrome hurting even the person who's expressing the prejudice. But we see it again and again now. The China initiative, which has been defeated temporarily, none of these victories is permanent, which portrayed professors in thousands of cases, not one or two, but in thousands of cases, because of their partnerships with China, including honorary titles, including the sort of things that colleges were encouraging until a few years ago, accused them of being spies. People lost their jobs. They were disgraced, even if they were world-class researchers, and even if they were innocent. Xiaoxing Shi, a prominent professor at Philadelphia, chair of the physics department, for example, uh, lost his chair position at Temple University, and ultimately all the charges were dropped, all of them. Sherry Chen, an award-winning climate change researcher with the National Weather Service, fired, labeled a spy, ultimately all charges dropped. Not only that, she settled a civil lawsuit for a couple $1 million, unheard of for the government to do that. And both those cases, part of the China initiative and so many others, Gang Chen, people who are renowned scientists working to cure cancer, they, because of who they were, because yes, had they visited China? Yes. Did they have family in China? Yes. They became accused of being spies, of engaging in felonious, treasonous behavior. There was more than one suicide, and people have taken up this as a cause. Out of this tragedy has been born a movement. Across the nation, in state after state and in Congress, there are bills now to restrict foreign ownership of land. Now, it's not just foreign. Some of these go so far as to target people of Chinese descent. And if you're looking with a realtor, how are they going to know, unless you pull out your passport, which I have on me at all times, whether or not you're foreign? So this perpetual foreigner syndrome continues to this day. It affects people's lives. This isn't some academic matter. It's not theoretical. It has actual consequences of people being hurt. Let me turn now to the third part that I'd like to touch on. What can we do? Because the United States is, and I hope always remains, a diverse democracy. This nation beckons. That's why we are here. Our ancestors, our parents or grandparents, or ourselves. Some of you here are newcomers. We were persuaded. My parents were. They watched movies after World War II that showed the great opportunities in America, and they believed. They sacrificed so much and came to this nation as scholarship students and put down new roots. I continue to believe. So what can we do? I'm going to suggest civic engagement, relationships and bridge building, and having different strategies. Let me start with the importance of civic engagement. And, it is a myth. It's one of those racial stereotypes of Asian immigrants being deferential and submissive. If you go back and look at the books, some of them are behind you. Look at the law books. Those early Chinese immigrants were feisty. They got organized, and in a way that should not be lost to history. They were willing to hire the best lawyers out there, meaning white lawyers, and pay them. They organized through family associations, and they protested. The Vincent Chin case brought out protests as never seen before. During COVID, I was new to Queens, New York. the world's borough, to Flushing, which has been revitalized. If you don't know Flushing, ride the 7 train out from Manhattan sometime, or if you land at JFK or LaGuardia, the best Chinese food is in Flushing, New York. Even better than you're going to find in some parts of China. And I went to a rally in downtown Flushing where elected officials, she was then the lieutenant governor, Kathy Hochul, she came. There were folks who were white, who were black, who were Jewish, who were Latino. There were labor leaders, and they stood alongside Asian Americans to fight the bias of the anti-Asian hate during COVID. And that gave me hope. It's the importance of ongoing civic engagement because when the crisis arises, if that's when you decide, well, now I better do something, it's too late. We have to have experience. We have to build out an infrastructure with organizations and be ready. Most importantly, and this is key, have relationships and build bridges to other groups. Take a look at Texas. In Texas, there have been recurring bills introduced at the state level for these alien land laws. And one of the most important people fighting that is Congressman Al Green of Houston. He's not Chinese. He's not Asian. I was on a video meeting with APA Justice, a very important project in this space. And Congresswoman Judy Chu sent in a video where she made it a point, Congresswoman Chu, Chinese American from Monterey Park, California, of singling out her colleague, Congressman Green. Because in Texas, he was the key person with experience, with a network to bring African Americans to see that this cause, it's really racial profiling. It's saying if you have this color of skin, texture of hair, shape of eye, you're a spy, you're a saboteur, you're a disloyal. It's using these characteristics to project, to infer, to stereotype. And for Congressman Green, when you hear him talk about that, he sees it as the same issue with a different face as the issue of driving while black and the racial profiling of African Americans. We have to show up for others so that they show up for us. Let me digress for just a moment. I want to leave ample time for questions. They'll be moderated. Please do feel free to put them in the chat. Cindy Tsai, a colleague and friend, she'll be asking me questions, and she should feel free. But I'm going to digress for just a minute to say something. I know it's easy for me to give a speech and talk about bridge building. It is so hard to show up. It's hard to show up in general. You get home, there's snow outside, you can Zoom, you can stream a movie, but to go out to a town meeting or that of a nonprofit, it's hard. Civic engagement is hard. I want to acknowledge that. And it's even more difficult when you show up and people think, what are you doing here? Your meeting's down the hall. When they think you're in the wrong meeting, or they might even be hostile because the people you want to build bridges to haven't seen you before. And I want to acknowledge a couple of difficulties. First difficulty I want to acknowledge openly, because we have to figure out a way to work through this, is that there are some issues where Asian immigrants, not all, but some Asian immigrants, some Asian Americans might have a different view about higher education, diversity, and access than some folks like Congressman Green. So we have to figure out, how can we ensure that when we show up, people know that we're not on the other side of the struggle, the historic struggle for Black equality, that we understand that struggle, that struggle is our struggle. Because if we ask people to be our ally, you have to be a friend to have a friend. But there's something even more difficult that I'm going to acknowledge, because I think, I want to be candid and live up to my name. So I'm going to mention something. It's even hard for Chinese Americans to work with other Asian Americans or with other Chinese Americans. I'm going to give you an example. My father, he's still with us. He's 90 years old. He lives in suburban Washington, D.C. He's lucid, still driving, at the point where we're not sure that's a great idea. One of the things he likes to do in the morning, he's a mall walker. You know what this is? You go to a mall because it's cold outside, and you walk 30 minutes or an hour. And he goes to a mall about a mile from where he lives. And I was chatting with him about this, and he said that the mall where he walks, there are three different groups. This is a true story. He said there are three different groups of older folks, senior citizens, who are mall walkers, who are of Chinese descent. They all know one another, and they wave politely, but they don't interact. Do you know what those three groups are? He said, one, there's a group of more recent arrivals from the mainland. Usually they're the parents of folks maybe my age, and I'm 59, folks in their 40s or 50s. So it's the parents of those folks. They just came from the mainland 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe. There's another group. I'm not going to mention which group my father is in, right? But he noted there are these three groups. The next group is of mainlanders who went to Taiwan and then came to the United States. And they came 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And there's a third group of people of Chinese descent who would identify themselves very proudly as Taiwanese, who are supportive of Taiwanese independence in a very overt way. So there are three different groups. To the rest of the people in the mall, the folks around them who are white or black or Latino, I'll bet they look at three groups of older Chinese folks circulating the mall, and they can't tell the difference among these three groups, but they don't interact. Now, I understand they might have different views, but here in the United States, we have a common cause. And if we can't get these groups together, we're going to have real difficulty getting them to work with African Americans or Jews or anyone else, because this sort of coalition building doesn't come easy. But that takes me to my third and final point. And I know Cindy's preparing some questions. It's okay to have different strategies. Here, I want to look to the example of Jewish organizations. If you get to know Jewish organizations, and perhaps there are people here who identify as Jewish, there are Asian Jews. They could be adoptees, converts through intermarriage, or from the tribes that were in Asia, the Kaifeng Jews from Shanghai and so on. Or, so if you are Jewish or have just gotten to know Jewish groups, you'll realize they span the spectrum from the right to the left, every type of group. They have every type of opinion you can imagine on controversies, and they have robust disagreement internally. But on a handful of core issues, they come together. In every major city, there's some type of umbrella organization, such as the JCRC, that brings them together. So that's what we need. And it's okay. We don't all have to agree. We don't have to have voted for the same person or the same cause. You can have some working at the grassroots, others working with high-end donors. We need to be bipartisan. We look at a DC strategy and beyond DC. The point is, we share a set of goals, I would assert, just by identifying ourselves as Asian American or Chinese American. And the goal is to belong, to be accepted as equals, while honoring our heritage. I'll observe the Lunar New Year, and probably many, maybe most on this Zoom will. And I'm glad that the City University of New York recognizes Lunar New Year now, by the way, as an official holiday. We won't have classes. But I'm an American through and through. I'm a kid from Detroit. I grew up in the 1970s. What I know is Disney, and this is where I'm staying. This is really where I'm from. And I would prefer, and I think it's reasonable, to not have to prove that again and again, to be suspected of being some sort of foreign agent if I go out for dim sum or for a banquet on Lunar New Year. That's what we're talking about. It's the same sort of thing that our friends who are Irish on St. Patrick's Day enjoy. They go out for a green beer. Everyone claims to be Irish that day. They march in a parade. But people the next day don't look at them and wonder if they're terrorists or if they're somehow not truly Americans. So I hope I've given you something to think about. I know Cindy's preparing some questions. Please do feel free to put them in the chat. And they've kindly put in a few of the op-eds that I've written about some of these subjects, including the China Initiative, the hate crimes, and the alien land laws. But to sum up, I've talked to you a little bit about the perpetual foreigner syndrome as it existed in the past, the perpetual foreigner syndrome as it continues to bedevil us today. And I hope I've given you a way to think about civic engagement, civil rights activism, standing up and speaking out. It doesn't mean that all of us have to become full-time activists. It means that some of us need to be trained in law, and those who are trained, as my parents wanted me to be, in engineering or medicine, can occasionally come out and join their cousins or can support organizations, whether it's APA Justice, Committee of 100, or any of the many others that now do this important work for Asian Americans and who are showing up alongside our friends who are African American, Latino, who are Jewish, who have been doing this for decades and who have been successful. We're finally now seeing these breakthroughs. Now, and on just a personal note, I know I would not be here in this seat in Queens, in Flushing, as the first Asian American president of Queens College if it weren't for a decade ago the advocacy of the Asian American Asian Research Institute of the City University of New York, a woman named Joyce Moy. Maybe some of you know her. I want to publicly acknowledge. She led an effort of faculty and staff to say why, in the entire history since City College was founded in 1847, have there been zero Asian Americans, East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, to serve as a president of one of the colleges or vice chancellor, and at last in 2020, not one but two Asian Americans were appointed as presidents and one as a vice chancellor. That happened. I'd like to think I have some merit and qualifications, but it didn't happen because of me alone. It didn't even happen mostly because of me. It happened because the community insisted that Asian American candidates be taken seriously, that they be looked at, that people not hear a foreign accent where there isn't one. We all have accents, and they should be accorded much greater respect. But for those of us who want to be part of this nation, when we say we are, others should not cast doubt on whether we are and intend to be and always will be real Americans. Thank you so very much, Cindy. I know you have some questions ready, and we have just a few minutes left.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Your words were extremely on point, inspiring for our audience. Actually, they heard you loud and clear about importance of civic engagement and to unite. So our first question is whether you have any advice or suggestion on how to unite the AAPI community, especially since we have very differing backgrounds, cultures, and there is a bit of an expectation that we're supposed to keep our head down, stay quiet, and avoid trouble. So any practical suggestions and advice?
So I wrote an essay. I'm going to just pull it off my bookshelf. So, there are now so many Chinese American leaders. A book was published about Chinese American leaders in higher education. It's an academic book. I'm not making a pitch for you to buy it. And I wrote a little essay. I want to tell you the title of the essay is what on the internet they call clickbait. And the very first, so I'm going to tell you what the title is, but I'm going to tell you what the first sentence is. I wrote an essay entitled Everything My Asian Immigrant Parents Taught Me Turns Out to Be Wrong. All right. And then in the very first sentence, I want to be clear, okay? Some of you on this Zoom probably know my father. My mother passed away about a decade ago. I say, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my parents, for the sacrifices they made, for the standards they set. So this is my little essay, okay? And I acknowledge. So I want to be clear. The title is just to get you to read it. And I'm going to go ahead and say something. All right, this is among friends. I'm very sensitive. I'm, I, 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 someone who stands against stereotyping. I don't want myself to engage in stereotyping. But I'm going to just mention a difference in some phrases, some aphorisms, adages, advice. So, in every Asian culture, there's a saying. The Japanese one's the best known. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. What is that about? Deference to your elders, conformity, fidelity to tradition, not making a fuss, being quiet, right? There's a Chinese phrase, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter, right? There's a Mandarin phrase, 不要找麻烦, right? Don't go looking for trouble, right? What is all this about? It's about let's just put our heads down. Let's just be quiet. Maybe people won't notice us. We'll just blend in the background. Compare the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Entirely different attitudes. So the very first thing we have to do, even before coalition building is at the core of everything that I advocate, is we ourselves have to decide, I'm willing to do this. I will stand up. I will speak out. I'll be controversial. I'll say something, maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'll raise my voice. Maybe I will even disagree with someone else, maybe someone in authority or someone who's Asian American. We have to be willing to do that. It's much easier to do that if you have other people with you. So that goes hand in hand with the idea of coalitions. I know we're almost out of time, so I'll take another question.
We have a couple of questions relating to the current ICE situation. And just briefly, if you could touch upon the current tension regarding ICE activities and how this community should be showing up, but also protecting themselves.
Right. So I'm going to answer both parts of that. Here too, I'm going to call out something. And I ask you to think about your cousin who has this. Every one of us has someone in our family who will say, oh, that's just about Latinos. It's not about us. We're good immigrants. We waited in line. Well, the original undocumented immigrants were the paper sons. If you don't know this history, and some people might not even realize that they have a paper son. I think most people know if you've ever met someone Chinese American who says, my name is Wu, but that's my paper name. My real name is Tsai. And then they'll explain somebody 3 generations, 4 generations ago bought some papers. Well, I have some news for you. That makes you actually, your entire lineage, undocumented. And they're coming for us. Make no mistake, they're looking at 2 things right now. I'm not making this up. Google it, confirm it. They're looking at denaturalization. I want you to understand how serious this is. Denaturalization of people who may have fibbed. And if you were a member of the Chinese Communist Party and you didn't say that, you could be denaturalized. Okay. The second example is if you look at every single immigration act, it always starts with people who are undocumented, who are vulnerable. But take a look at all the visas now that are going to be denied from all these different nations, many of them Asian nations. Do not be fooled. This is not just about Latinos. This is not just about the undocumented. It's about Asian Americans, Asian immigrants. It's about Asian undocumented immigrants. And then in terms of protecting yourself, the best way we can protect ourselves is to have allies. I am not proposing that anyone on this Zoom, myself included, go out there all by ourselves and say, me, and start tweeting out things just on their own. That's unwise. Work with established organizations, Committee of 100, through this series. Find events. Don't just go out there by yourself. Coalitions are the key in a democracy. We're a minority. But if we come together with other minorities, look at Gary Locke, ambassador to China, governor, chair of Committee of 100, when he ran in Washington State. Some people misunderstand. Seattle and Washington State, yes, they have people of Asian background. They have had for more than a century. Gary gives a moving speech about the 2 generations, 3 counting him, that it took his family to travel from being a houseboy, a domestic, to the governor's mansion. But you know what? You know how Gary Locke won? It was not by getting every Asian American to vote for him. If he'd gotten every Asian American to vote for him and nobody else, he would have lost decisively. He won by building bridges. He got folks who were white, black, Latino, Jewish, Arab, because he had a message that resonated. That's the example. I know we're out of time again, Cindy. I'm so deeply honored to be the first speaker in this important series. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. And I apologize for those who submitted questions and we weren't able to get to them. We will touch base with Frank and translate them into possibly a blog, or Frank does wonderful articles. But you all brought in very important topics. Like I said before, this seminar will be monthly, the third Tuesday of every month. So the next one will be set on March 17th. Please do complete the post-event survey and let us know if there are specific topics that you would like us to discuss in this series. Thank you again, Frank, for joining us for our first of hopefully many webinars to come.
Great.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much. Bye bye now.